one thing clearly. The phrase crime lord belongs entirely to our era. The people you're about to meet had completely unique words for themselves. So before we begin, a simple positive review helps us expand our reach to people who might need this for sleep. Let us know how your day was and what time it is for you. Now pull your blanket up, adjust your pillow, and dim those pesky lights. You are sitting beside a narrow window in a stone inn somewhere in the Rhine Valley, sometime around the middle of the 13th century. The fire behind you has burned down to orange coals, throwing a low, steady warmth across the flagstone floor. Outside, the river moves through the dark, a sound like someone running their fingers along a very long page. You can just make out the shape of a tower on the opposite bank, a square block of shadow against a sky thick with stars, with a single torch burning at its upper edge. The man who lives in that tower charges every boat that passes a fee for the right to continue passing. If you were a merchant travelling this river in the year 1265, you would have already paid similar fees at a dozen stations upstream, and you would pay them at a dozen more before you reached your destination. You would have added those costs to your prices before you left home. You would have had opinions about every toll station on the route, about which ones were managed by reasonable men, and which were run by men who invented a new number each time a well-loaded barge came into view. None of those opinions would have used the word criminal. The language you would have reached for was something closer to the way of things. This is the fundamental strangeness of the medieval world, the thing that tends to stop people when they first encounter it. The idea of a single unified authority that defines the law, enforces it across a consistent territory, and holds lords and commoners alike to the same standard is, measured against the whole span of human history, quite recent. Medieval European authority was layered, overlapping, and genuinely disputed at almost every level. A king might claim to rule a territory in full. A duke might argue that the king's reach did not extend to his particular valley. A bishop might insist that church lands answered to Rome and to no earthly power beneath that. And the man with the tower and the torch might simply point to his walls and his garrison and consider the conversation finished. Power in this world was not handed down from above and then distributed in orderly fashion. It was accumulated through inheritance and marriage and purchase and conquest, and sometimes through nothing more than a sustained willingness to defend what you claimed. The figures who appeared in medieval chronicles as criminals were often doing exactly what lords were doing, except they were doing it without the particular piece of parchment that said they were entitled to do it. That parchment mattered, but perhaps not as much as a later world would expect it to. Walking through the physical landscape of medieval Europe, you're moving through a patchwork of jurisdictions so complicated that even the people living inside them could not always tell you with confidence who held authority over a particular stretch of road or a particular bend of river. A journey from a Rhineland city to an Italian market might cross lands belonging to a dozen different lords before it reached the first Alpine pass, each of them collecting tolls, demanding respect, and applying their own version of a local custom to whatever disputes arose within their reach. The Holy Roman Empire, which covered much of what is now Germany, Austria, and parts of northern Italy, was described by observers in later centuries as neither particularly holy, nor especially Roman, nor in any practical sense a unified empire. Part of what they meant by that observation was the sheer difficulty of exercising central authority over a territory composed of hundreds of competing power centres, each defending its own prerogatives with considerable determination and a fair amount of stone construction. Into this landscape stepped certain figures with tremendous confidence. The phrase robber baron was applied by later centuries to medieval lords who built their incomes on systematic extortion. But the word baron is doing a great deal of work in that phrase. These were not simply bandits who happened to dress better. Many of them held genuine titles and genuine lands. They had been granted or had inherited or had simply asserted authority over particular roads, rivers, bridges, or mountain passes, and they had turned that authority into something that functioned from the inside very much like a revenue operation. The mechanics of this were direct enough if you set the violence aside for a moment to examine the structure. You controlled a road. Everyone who needed to use that road either paid you or did not use the road. If they tried to pass without paying, you sent mounted men after them. If they paid, you called the payment a legitimate custom of the region and used the income to keep your walls repaired and your hired men fed and ready for the next caravan. From inside the arrangement, this looked like governance. From outside, it looked like extortion with better architecture. The honest answer is that both descriptions were simultaneously accurate, and the medieval world had no particular interest in resolving the contradiction. The kings and emperors of the period were not passive in the face of this situation. Sometimes they organized military expeditions against particularly notorious offenders, bringing coalitions of forces to demolish castles that had become too brazen. The Rhine League of 1254, a coalition of German cities that banded together to suppress unauthorized tolls, spent several energetic years demolishing fortifications and dealing with their occupants in terms that left no room for repeat offences. But those same rulers also made quiet use of the very figures they publicly condemned. A lord who controlled a river crossing could also close that crossing to an enemy fleet at a moment of military crisis. A man who had spent 15 years building a network of hired fighters and information contacts was potentially very valuable in a war. The line between royal ally and licensed criminal was one that medieval states often preferred to leave comfortably undefined. The economic logic beneath all of this had, in a peculiar way, a certain internal coherence. The infrastructure of medieval trade genuinely required maintenance. Roads needed repair after winter floods and spring rains dissolved their surfaces. Bridges needed rebuilding when floods took out spans. Mountain passes needed clearing after avalanches sealed them. Someone had to pay for this work, and the toll system, at its most functional, was a reasonable mechanism for funding that maintenance by charging the people who benefited from it. The problem was that the person setting the rate was also the person collecting it, and the person collecting it was also the person with the armed garrison who would pursue you if you found the rate unreasonable. Independent oversight was not readily available. Medieval merchants understood this with the kind of practical clarity that comes from navigating it personally, season after season, cargo load after cargo load. A merchant caravan leaving a city in the Rhineland bound for the Italian markets had already added the expected toll costs to its prices before the first pack animal was loaded. The merchants knew which routes were cheaper in aggregate, even if the road was longer. They knew which lords offered predictable fees, and which invented new charges the moment a fully loaded wagon appeared on their horizon. They knew which river sections were safest and during which months. This was a landscape that experienced travellers moved through intelligently, not randomly. The response from trading communities was also organised and intelligent. Cities formed leagues. Merchants shared information about bad actors through their networks. The most effective response of all was organised commercial power converting itself into organised military capacity, the moment when the merchants stopped trying to root around the problem and began addressing it. Directly. That comes later in the night. For now, the important thing to carry forward is that this world was not chaotic in a random way. It was chaotic in a patterned way, following its own recognizable rules and its own rough codes. The violence was embedded in a system, and that system, for all its brutality, was one that people inside it understood with considerable sophistication. That makes them very human, even at a distance of 7 centuries. The coals in the inn are still glowing. The tower across the river is quiet. You are going to visit it, and quite a few towers like it, before the night is over. By the year 1300, the number of toll stations operating on the Rhine River had grown to somewhere between 60 and 80, depending on how you counted and which source you consulted. Take a 60 to 80 separate stations on a single river. A merchant travelling from the city of Mainz to the city of Cologne, a stretch of roughly 160 kilometres, could expect to pay fees at more than a dozen of them within a single day's journey. The cost of any given transaction might be modest enough. The accumulated weight of a dozen modest transactions was not modest at all. Merchants arrived at their destinations lighter, in the purse not from any single act of robbery, but from the compounding pressure of too many hands extended across too many stretches of water. This was the fundamental shape of the robber baron problem in Germany, and it replicated itself with regional variations across most of Western Europe. The people operating these toll stations were not necessarily grand aristocrats with vast estates. Some were minor knights with a single tower and a good view of the river. Some were wealthier lords who had systematically bought out or outfought their neighbours and consolidated control of a useful stretch of water or road. Some were bishops or abbots, since the church held enormous property across the continent and had no particular theological objection to collecting tolls from the faithful as they passed through. Picture one of these towers now, damp grey stone rising from the riverbank, the lower courses practically in the water at high season, the upper windows looking out across the current in both directions, iron chains that could be stretched from bank to bank in the evening hours, not to stop passage but to ensure that no boats slipped through without being noticed. In the morning, a man would lean from a window and address the bargeman below, and the bargemen, who had done this before, would already have their coins ready. The Rhine was not alone in this. The Moselle had its toll stations, the Danube had them, the Elbe had them, the main roads through the Alps had them at every pass, the coastal approaches to major ports had them. In France, the Loire and the Seine had their own complicated histories of private toll collection, and the commercial resistance that rose against it. The German situation was particularly extreme because of the particular character of the Holy Roman Empire. The emperors of this period were powerful men in theory, and considerably more limited men in practice, partly because the imperial position was elective rather than hereditary. Each new emperor owed substantial political debts to the princes who had voted for him, which meant those princes accumulated rights and privileges over time that made them progressively harder to govern. The emperor could declare things, the princes could decline to implement them. The man in the tower on the Rhine was downstream from all of this, figuratively and sometimes literally. Into this environment stepped the figures known in German sources as Raubritter, which translates directly as robber knights. These were men of the knightly class who had converted road control and river tolls into their primary occupation, not as a supplement to legitimate governance, but as the main activity itself. The most famous name in this tradition is Gottfried von Berlichingen, known throughout the German-speaking world as Goetz, a man who left enough of a mark on the historical record to become the subject of a play by Goethe 4 centuries after his death. Goetz lost his right hand during a siege in the early 16th century and had an iron prosthetic made for it, a piece of functional engineering that still survives in a museum in Germany and still draws visitors who want to look at the hand of a man who refused to let a minor inconvenience, like losing his original one, slow him down. He spent decades raiding merchant convoys, feuding with cities and minor lords, hiring himself out for other people's wars, and being periodically placed under imperial ban, which was the German legal equivalent of being declared an outlaw. The imperial ban was theoretically severe. It placed a person outside the protection of the law and theoretically allowed anyone to attack him without consequence. In practice, a man with a fortified castle, a loyal garrison, and a network of political relationships was not especially vulnerable to theoretical declarations, however sternly worded, and Goetz operated freely for decades despite being banned on multiple occasions. His memoir, which he dictated in old age, presents his career as honourable service to the knightly code, and he saw no particular contradiction between that self-image and the contents of his activities. He is instructive because he occupied the middle zone between lord and criminal so completely and so comfortably. He was not a common bandit. He had a name, a lineage, a code he articulated explicitly, and a web of relationships with other knights, lords, and cities that gave him both protection and employment. He was also, by any reasonable external measure, a man who built his living on extortion and targeted violence. His memoir presents both of these things at once and treats the tension between them as not particularly interesting. The border families of the Scottish and English borderlands operated on a similar logic and with similar comfort. The Armstrong clan, the Elliots, the Grahams, the Nixons, and dozens of others had spent generations in a landscape that alternated between declared warfare and nominal peace, without ever quite settling into either for long. In wartime, they served whichever side offered better terms. In quieter periods, they raided across the border for cattle, goods, and occasionally for people whom they held until their families negotiated a price for their return. The ransom economy deserves a careful look because it was a significant economic institution in medieval Europe rather than a marginal criminal practice. The rules of ransom were well established among the knightly class. If you captured an enemy of equivalent standing on the battlefield, you were entitled to hold him until his people paid for his return. This was accepted practice and was explicitly recognized in the customs of war as they existed at the time. The system depended on a shared understanding between participants, a kind of mutual recognition that captivity and release were preferable to death on both sides. The difficulty was that the logic extended naturally beyond the battlefield. If capturing a knight for ransom was legitimate, what about a wealthy merchant on a trade road? What about a churchman traveling with a small escort? What about a minor lord moving between properties with fewer men than he should have? The rules became considerably murkier as the social distance from formal warfare increased. The border families applied the same practical spirit to all of it. A captive was worth what his household was willing to pay. Negotiations moved through intermediaries and could take weeks or months. The prisoner was, as a rule, housed and fed adequately, because a poorly treated captive whose family had heard bad reports was a negotiating problem, and a dead captive was worth nothing at all. The whole thing was, from one angle, a sophisticated credit arrangement with human beings as collateral. From another angle, it was kidnapping conducted at a professional level. Both descriptions were accurate, and the border families saw no reason to choose between them. Smuggling ran as a quiet parallel to legitimate commerce throughout the whole of the medieval period, and it was economically significant in ways the written sources tend to underreport, since people who were moving goods illegally had professional reasons not to document the activity carefully. Raw wool was the great contraband of medieval England. The Crown collected substantial export duties on wool because the trade was enormously valuable, and the duties were a major source of royal revenue. The merchants who preferred to keep that revenue for themselves found their way to quieter harbours, dealt with ship captains who were willing to load at night, and moved their cargo across the Channel under conditions that the customs officials on shore either could not see or had been paid not to see. This was organised, well-funded, and operated with the willing cooperation of local officials who received payment for their useful blindness. The people running it were not outcasts or desperate men. They were integrated into the normal commercial life of the ports where they worked, and the money from the avoided duties flowed back into legitimate trade without ceremony or difficulty. The boundaries of the medieval economy were genuinely porous in this way. A merchant who paid his duties at one port might use the profits to fund a separate unlicensed operation from a quieter one. A lord collecting legitimate bridge tolls might also operate a protection arrangement on the road approaches to that bridge, charging separately for the service of not having the bridge suddenly become unavailable when you needed it most. The same vessels that carried licensed cargo one week might be carrying something entirely different the next, with no particular sense of moral discontinuity among the people involved. The physical geography of the border regions shaped this culture in ways that were deeply practical. The Cheviot Hills between England and Scotland were not simply scenery, they were operational terrain. The valleys that cut through them were routes that experienced riders could navigate in darkness, moving quickly across ground that was slow in pursuit. The shallow river crossings that the families knew by memory were invisible advantages over anyone chasing them who did not share that knowledge. The peel towers that dotted the landscape, small fortified stone houses where families could shelter their most important possessions and animals on short notice, were not expressions of wealth. They were the architecture of an economy built on speed and the expectation of reciprocal raiding. The families also maintained something that functioned very much like intelligence networks, though nobody would have used that language. Knowledge of when a neighboring lord's household was understaffed, when a merchant was traveling with fewer guards than usual, when the weather was coming in hard enough to make pursuit impractical. All of this circulated through the communities on both sides of the border, through a combination of kinship ties, market day gossip, and the informal channels of people who had a professional interest in knowing what was happening on the other side of the hill. This was not a subculture operating in isolation from mainstream society. It was embedded in it. The same families that raided across the border also farmed, traded at market, paid their tithes, and attended church. Their raiding was one economic activity among several, weighted more heavily in difficult years when the harvest was poorer and lighter, in good years when legitimate income was sufficient. The border as a zone of chronic low-level conflict was also a border zone where the two cultures on either side knew each other intimately, spoke related dialects, shared many of the same surnames, and maintained kinship connections that political boundaries could not fully interrupt. What medieval people understood, in ways that later eras sometimes lost sight of, was that the rules of economic life were negotiated rather than absolute. You paid what you could not avoid paying. You avoided what you could get away with avoiding. The officials who were supposed to enforce the rules were embedded in the same economy, subject to the same pressures, and generally interested in their own outcomes rather than any abstract public good. The whole system ran on a permanent negotiation between competing interests, lubricated by informal payments that appeared in nobody's official records. This is the world you need to hold in mind as we move forward tonight. Not a world of clean lines between honest and dishonest, but a world of people working the available gaps in a system that was constructed almost entirely of gaps, some with ingenuity, some with violence, and most with an unself-conscious combination of the two. There is a French verse romance written in the early 13th century that tells the story of a man who studied the dark arts in Toledo, became a knight, entered a monastery, abandoned his vows, served 3 separate kings, commanded the English Channel from a fleet of 30 ships for the better part of 2 decades, and was finally killed in a naval engagement, after which his severed head was carried on a pike through the streets of a port town so that anyone who had been uncertain about his current